Margaret "Maggie" Rivera had driven through the night to reach Annapolis. Her old Honda sedan rattled as she pulled into the parking lot of the Naval Academy, the morning sun casting long shadows across the historic grounds. At 62 years old, she felt every mile of that 12-hour drive from her small apartment in rural Georgia. Today was the day her son, Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Rivera, would graduate from the Naval Academy's officer training program. It had been 3 years since she'd seen him in person. Video calls and occasional letters had been their only connection while he dedicated himself to following in her footsteps, though he knew only part of her story. Maggie stepped out of her car and smoothed down her simple blue dress. She'd bought it at a thrift store specifically for this occasion. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness about the ceremony, but from the pain that shot through her joints. The doctors called it arthritis, a souvenir from years of service in conditions that would have broken most people. She didn't complain. She never complained. As she walked toward the ceremony grounds, she passed groups of well-dressed families. The mothers wore designer outfits and carried expensive handbags. The fathers stood tall in suits that probably cost more than Maggie's monthly rent. They chatted excitedly about their sons and daughters, about the promising careers ahead, about family traditions of service. Maggie walked alone. She found a seat near the back of the assembly area, content to blend into the crowd. That had always been her way: serve quietly, never seek attention, do what needed to be done and move on. The metal folding chair felt cold even through her dress, but she barely noticed. Her eyes scanned the assembled graduates, searching for Daniel's face. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" A woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. Maggie looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s, her blonde hair perfectly styled, pearl necklace catching the morning light. "No, please," Maggie said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. The woman sat down with a grateful sigh, then immediately turned to Maggie with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Patricia Moreland. My son Charles is graduating today. He's at the top of his class, you know. We're so proud. Is this your first time at the academy?" "Yes, ma'am," Maggie replied softly. "My son Daniel is graduating too." Patricia's eyes swept over Maggie's simple dress and worn shoes. Her smile became more condescending. "How nice, and where is your husband? Will he be joining you?" "I'm not married," Maggie said evenly. "It's just me." "Oh," Patricia's tone carried a mix of pity and judgment. "That must have been difficult, raising a boy alone. Did you serve in the military yourself?" "Is that how he became interested?" Maggie hesitated. She'd learned long ago that people made assumptions about her, and correcting them often led to questions she preferred not to answer. "I served, yes, a long time ago." "How wonderful," Patricia said in a way that clearly meant she thought it was anything but wonderful. "Were you a clerk, or perhaps in the medical corps? My father always said the support staff were the backbone of the military." Before Maggie could respond, a man in an expensive suit joined them, Patricia's husband, judging by the way she immediately clutched his arm. "Richard, this is—" She paused, realizing she hadn't asked Maggie's name. "Margaret Rivera," Maggie supplied, "but everyone calls me Maggie." "Maggie's son is graduating today too," Patricia told her husband. "She served in the military herself. Isn't that sweet?" Richard barely glanced at Maggie before turning his attention to the stage where the ceremony would take place. "The Admiral is supposed to speak today," he said to Patricia. "Admiral James Hawthorne, very distinguished. Charles has been hoping to make an impression on him." The ceremony began shortly after, with the traditional pomp and circumstance that the Naval Academy was known for. Maggie watched with pride as the graduates marched in formation, their white uniforms crisp and pristine. When she spotted Daniel among them, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. He stood tall and confident, everything she'd hoped he would become. The academy superintendent gave a speech about duty and honor. Then came the moment Richard had mentioned. Admiral James Hawthorne took the podium. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a long and decorated career. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. It had been nearly 40 years, but she knew it. The Admiral began to speak about service and sacrifice, about the traditions they were upholding. His voice was strong and clear, carrying across the assembly. Today you join a legacy of brave men and women who have defended our nation through every challenge. Some of their stories are well known, many are not, but every story matters. As he spoke, his eyes swept across the crowd. For just a moment, Maggie could have sworn his gaze lingered on her section. But that was impossible. He wouldn't recognize her, not after all these years, not looking like she did now. Patricia leaned over to whisper loudly enough for others to hear, "The Admiral's speech is always the highlight. Charles says he's a legend, served in some of the most dangerous operations in naval history." Maggie said nothing. She knew exactly what operations the Admiral had served in. She'd been there for some of them. When the speech ended and the graduates received their commissions, Maggie felt her heart swell with pride. Daniel had done it. Despite everything, despite growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, despite never knowing his father, despite all the sacrifices they'd both made, he'd achieved his dream. After the ceremony, families rushed forward to congratulate their graduates. Maggie hung back, letting the crowd thin before approaching Daniel. She watched as Patricia and Richard embraced their son Charles, cameras flashing, other family members joining in celebration. Finally, Daniel spotted her. His face lit up in a way that made every hardship worthwhile. "Mom!" He broke away from his fellow graduates and strode toward her, scooping her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground despite her protests. "Daniel put me down," she laughed, but held him tight. "I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." His voice was thick with emotion. "Everything I am is because of you." "Now that's not true," Maggie said, pulling back to look at him. "You did this yourself. You earned this." A voice interrupted them. "Excuse me." They turned to find Patricia standing there with Charles and Richard. Patricia's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held that same judgment Maggie had seen earlier. Charles wanted to meet his fellow graduates. "You must be Daniel." The 2 young men shook hands with genuine warmth that their parents didn't share. "Great to meet you officially," Charles said. "We've had some classes together." "Your tactical analysis presentation last month was brilliant," Daniel grinned. "Thanks, man, that means a lot." Patricia's smile tightened as she looked at Maggie. "You must be so relieved that Daniel made it through the program. I imagine it wasn't easy given his circumstances." The implication hung in the air, that Daniel had somehow been at a disadvantage, that his single mother couldn't have possibly prepared him adequately. Daniel's jaw tightened, but Maggie gently touched his arm. "We've been blessed," she said simply. "Daniel has always been determined." "Well, determination is important," Richard said dismissively. "But breeding and tradition count for something too. Charles is 4th-generation Navy, it's in his blood." Before anyone could respond, a stir rippled through the crowd. Admiral Hawthorne was making his way through the families, stopping occasionally to congratulate graduates. As he drew nearer to their group, Patricia practically vibrated with excitement. "Oh my goodness, he's coming this way," she whispered urgently to Richard. "Make sure he meets Charles." The Admiral did indeed approach their group, but his eyes weren't on Charles or Richard or Patricia. They were fixed on Maggie with an expression of growing recognition and disbelief. He stopped directly in front of her, and the noise of the crowd seemed to fade away. "Lieutenant Rivera," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maggie Rivera." Maggie straightened her spine, decades of military bearing coming back despite the pain in her joints. "Admiral Hawthorne, it's good to see you again, sir." Daniel looked between them in confusion. "Mom, you know the Admiral." Patricia's carefully constructed smile had frozen on her face. Richard stared in disbelief. The Admiral's eyes had filled with an emotion Maggie couldn't quite name, respect certainly, but also something that looked like regret. "Know her," he said, loud enough now that people around them began to quiet and turn. "Young man, I owe my life to your mother." The crowd around them had grown silent, curious faces turning toward the small group. Admiral Hawthorne seemed to realize they'd become the center of attention, and something shifted in his expression, a decision being made. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private," he suggested, though his eyes never left Maggie's face. There was an urgency in his voice, a need to say things that had apparently gone unsaid for too long, but Maggie shook her head gently. "With respect, Admiral, I came here to celebrate my son. That's all that matters today." "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel asked, confusion written across his face. How do you know the Admiral? Patricia found her voice, though it came out strained. Yes, I'm quite curious myself. You said you served, but you implied it was. Well, nothing significant. Maggie felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention pressing down on her. This was exactly what she'd spent decades avoiding. I never said it wasn't significant, ma'am. You assumed. The Admiral cleared his throat. Lieutenant Rivera was one of the finest intelligence officers I ever had the privilege of serving with. She saved not just my life, but the lives of countless others. He looked around at the assembled crowd, which had grown larger. And she did it at tremendous personal cost. Intelligence, Richard's skepticism was clear. Not to be rude, but that seems unlikely given. He trailed off, but his meaning was clear as his eyes took in Maggie's simple appearance, her worn shoes, her age. Given what exactly? The Admiral's voice had turned cold. Given that she's a woman. Given that she's standing here in a dress from a thrift store instead of designer clothes. Let me tell you something about Lieutenant Rivera. Sir, please, Maggie said quietly. This isn't necessary. It absolutely is necessary, the Admiral replied firmly. You've been silent long enough. He turned back to Daniel. Your mother was recruited into naval intelligence in 1983, fresh out of college with a degree in Middle Eastern studies and fluency in 3 languages. By 1985, she was one of our primary assets in the Mediterranean theater. Daniel's eyes widened. His mother had never told him any of this. She'd mentioned serving in the Navy, but always changed the subject when he pressed for details. The Admiral continued, and Maggie noticed other high-ranking officers beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. In 1987, I was a young lieutenant commander, leading a team into a situation we didn't fully understand. The intelligence we'd been given was compromised. We walked straight into a trap in Beirut. We would have all died if Lieutenant Rivera hadn't realized what was happening and gotten word to us through back channels. He paused, his voice dropping, but her cover was blown in the process. A chill ran through the crowd despite the warm morning sun. These were military families. They understood what a blown cover meant for an intelligence operative in a hostile region during the Cold War. I spent 6 months in captivity, Maggie said softly, finally speaking. She kept her eyes on Daniel, needing him to hear this from her, not strangers. It was a long time ago, honey. I'm fine now. 6 months of torture, the Admiral corrected, and there was anger in his voice, not at Maggie but at the injustice of what came after. 6 months before we could mount a rescue operation. And when we brought her home, she spent another year in military hospitals recovering from injuries that still affect her today. Maggie saw Daniel's face go pale. She'd told him she had arthritis, that she'd hurt her back in an accident during service. She'd never told him that her hands shook sometimes because they'd been broken repeatedly, that she couldn't stand for long periods because of what had been done to her feet, that the scars hidden beneath her simple dress told a story of survival that most people couldn't imagine. Patricia had gone quiet, her earlier condescension replaced by shock. Charles stood with his mouth slightly open, looking at Maggie with new eyes. Mom, Daniel's voice cracked. Why didn't you tell me? Because it was over, Maggie said simply. Because I wanted you to look forward, not back. Because the past doesn't define us, our choices do. That's not the end of the story, the Admiral said, and now his voice carried a note of bitterness. When Lieutenant Rivera was finally well enough to return to duty, she was offered early retirement at her current rank. No promotion for her valor, no public recognition, no medal ceremony. The operation was classified, they said. National security, they said. She was given a small disability pension and a handshake. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Several of the older officers exchanged glances that suggested they knew exactly what the Admiral was describing, the way inconvenient heroes were sometimes shuffled aside, especially in the world of intelligence where public recognition could be dangerous or embarrassing to the wrong people. I took the retirement, Maggie said. I was pregnant with Daniel and I wanted to focus on being a mother. It was my choice. Pregnant, Richard said, and even he had the grace to sound chastened. You went through all that while pregnant. I didn't know I was pregnant until after I was rescued, Maggie explained. The doctors weren't sure at first if Daniel would be okay after everything. But he was. He's always been my miracle. Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his mother, and Maggie held him tight, not caring about the crowd anymore. "You're my miracle too," he whispered. Admiral Hawthorne watched them with an expression of deep sadness. "I've regretted the way things ended for you," he told Maggie. "I was too junior then to fight the decision. By the time I had enough rank to do something about it, too many years had passed. The operation was still classified. Your name was buried in files that most people couldn't access." "It's all right, Admiral," Maggie said, pulling back from Daniel and wiping her eyes. "I made peace with it a long time ago." "Well, I haven't," the Admiral said firmly. He looked around at the assembled crowd, at the officers, at the new graduates. "And I think it's time some things changed." Patricia stepped forward hesitantly. "Ms. Rivera, I apologize. I made assumptions. I was rude and condescending, and I'm sorry." Maggie nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "We all make assumptions sometimes. But I don't understand something," Patricia continued. "After everything you did, everything you sacrificed, why didn't you fight for recognition? Why accept early retirement? You could have had a full career, accolades, a pension that reflected your service." "I had something more important to do," Maggie said simply, looking at Daniel. "I had a son to raise, and I didn't do what I did for accolades. I did it because it was right." One of the older officers in the crowd spoke up, a captain with gray hair and kind eyes. "That's the mark of a true hero," he said. "Someone who serves without needing the spotlight." Admiral Hawthorne straightened to his full height. "Captain, you're absolutely right, which is why I'm going to do something I should have done years ago." He turned to his aide, a young lieutenant who'd been standing nearby. "Get me in touch with the Secretary of the Navy. Today. I don't care what else is on his schedule." "Sir?" the aide asked, startled. "That's an order, Lieutenant. And while you're at it, contact my office and have them pull every file related to Operation Copper Shield from 1987. It's time some of those files were declassified." A murmur ran through the crowd. Declassifying old intelligence operations was no small matter, even ones from nearly 4 decades ago. "Admiral, you don't have to do this," Maggie said, but there was a tremor in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely sure she believed her own words. "Yes, I do," he replied firmly. "I should have done it years ago. You deserve recognition. You deserve the full pension and benefits you should have received. And frankly, these young graduates deserve to know the real stories of service, not just the ones that fit neatly into press releases." Daniel stood straighter, his hand on his mother's shoulder. "Thank you, sir. My mother has never asked for anything for herself. She's worked 3 jobs sometimes just to make ends meet, to put me through school before I got to the academy. She never complained, never asked for help, never," his voice broke. "Never told you the truth about why she couldn't work more physically demanding jobs," the Admiral finished gently. "Because of injuries sustained in service to her country." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the people on the edges who couldn't hear everything seemed to sense something important was happening. Richard cleared his throat. "Admiral, I spoke out of turn earlier. I questioned Ms. Rivera's service based on shallow judgments. I apologize." He turned to Maggie. "And I apologize to you, ma'am. It's clear that Charles and I have much to learn about real service." Charles nodded emphatically. "Daniel, your mom she's incredible. I'm honored to serve alongside someone raised by a true hero." Patricia wiped her eyes. "We all are," she said softly, but one voice spoke up from the crowd, an older woman Maggie hadn't noticed before, wearing a jacket covered in pins and patches that marked her as a veteran herself. "Excuse me, but I have a question." The woman pushed her way forward. "Lieutenant Rivera, you said you were held for 6 months in 1987. In Beirut?" Maggie nodded slowly. The woman's eyes widened. "Were you the ghost?" The Admiral tensed. "That's still classified information." "Oh, come on, Admiral," the veteran said. "Everyone in intelligence back then heard whispers about the ghost, the operative who transmitted crucial intel even while being held captive, who managed to get information out that prevented 3 separate attacks. We never knew the name, but we knew someone was out there paying a terrible price for that intelligence." Maggie said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "My God," the veteran breathed. You're the one." She straightened and saluted, even though she was in civilian clothes, even though decades had passed since she'd served. "Ma'am, it's an honor. Slowly, one by one, the veterans in the crowd, and there were many parents and grandparents of graduates, came to attention and saluted. Then the active duty officers joined them. Then the new graduates, including Daniel and Charles. Maggie stood there, this slight woman in her thrift store dress, and accepted the respect she'd never asked for but had always deserved. Tears streamed down her face, but she held herself with the bearing of the soldier she'd once been. Admiral Hawthorne saluted as well, holding it longer than protocol required. When he finally dropped his hand, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Lieutenant Margaret Rivera, on behalf of the United States Navy and every person whose life you saved, thank you for your service. The debt we owe you can never be truly repaid, but I give you my word that I will spend whatever time I have left in this uniform working to ensure you receive the recognition you deserve." The crowd burst into applause, and Maggie felt Daniel's arm around her shoulders, holding her up as her knees threatened to buckle under the weight of 4 decades of silence finally being broken. The ceremony grounds had cleared somewhat, families dispersing to celebrate with their newly commissioned officers. But a small group remained around Maggie, Admiral Hawthorne, several senior officers, Daniel, and a handful of others who seemed reluctant to let this moment pass without hearing more of a story that had been buried for too long. The veteran woman who'd recognized the name The Ghost introduced herself as Commander Sarah Chen, retired. "I worked in naval intelligence from 1985 to 1995, she explained to the group. "The Ghost was a legend among us. We'd see intelligence come through that was so detailed, so accurate, that it had to be from someone deep in hostile territory. But the cost—" She looked at Maggie with understanding that only another intelligence officer could have. "We knew whoever it was had to be enduring hell to get that information out." "I did what needed to be done," Maggie said quietly. She'd found a bench to sit on, and Daniel sat beside her, still processing everything he'd learned about his mother in the past hour. Admiral Hawthorne had been on his phone for several minutes, speaking in low, urgent tones. Now he returned to the group. "The Secretary of the Navy will see me tomorrow morning. I'm going to recommend immediate review of your case for back pay, benefits adjustment, and consideration for valor awards that should have been given decades ago." "Admiral, I appreciate it, but I'm not sure I want to go through all that," Maggie said. "I've built a quiet life. I like my quiet life." "Mom," Daniel said gently, "maybe you deserve more than a quiet life. Maybe you deserve justice." "Justice is a complicated word," Maggie replied. She looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some respectful, all attentive. "The truth is, I wasn't the only one who suffered. There were others, local people who helped me, who risked everything to pass along information. Some of them died, some disappeared. My story is connected to theirs, and I don't know if I have the right to bring it all back up." Commander Chen nodded slowly. "That's the burden of intelligence work that civilians don't understand. Every story is connected to others. Every revelation risks someone else." "But surely after 40 years, Patricia began, then stopped herself. She'd been mostly quiet since her apology, staying at the edges of the group with Richard and Charles. "After 40 years, the people involved might have families who still don't know what happened," Maggie said. "Children and grandchildren who don't know their father or grandfather was a hero, or a traitor, depending on which side they were on," she sighed. "It's not as simple as just telling my story." Admiral Hawthorne crouched down so he was at eye level with Maggie. "I understand your concerns, but consider this. How many other stories like yours are buried in classified files? How many other people who gave everything for their country are working 3 jobs in their 60s because the system failed them? Your story could change policy. It could help others." Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Daniel took her hand and she squeezed it gently. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course," the Admiral said, "but I'm still moving forward with the review of your benefits and pension. That much you can't argue me out of. You earned that through your service, regardless of whether the full story ever becomes public." A younger officer who'd been listening spoke up, a lieutenant commander with an earnest expression. "Ma'am, if I may ask, how did you survive? 6 months in captivity, being tortured for information. How do you come back from that?" Maggie smiled sadly. "You find a reason to live. For me, I didn't know it at the time, but I was carrying that reason. She looked at Daniel. The doctors told me later that the pregnancy might have actually saved my life. It gave my body something to fight for beyond just survival. Some instinct kicked in to protect the baby, even when I might have given up protecting myself. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. You never told me any of this. How do you tell your child that they were born from such darkness? Maggie asked. I wanted you to know joy, not pain. I wanted you to believe in goodness, not cruelty. But you also taught me about duty and honor, Daniel said. You taught me that service means sacrifice. I just didn't know how much you'd actually sacrificed. Commander Chen spoke up again. Lieutenant Rivera, please, just Maggie, she interrupted gently. Maggie, Chen continued, I want to tell you something. In 1989, I was analyzing intelligence patterns in the Mediterranean region for my thesis at the War College. I noticed something. There was a 6-month period in 1987 where we had an unprecedented run of successful operations. Attacks prevented, cells disrupted, hostages recovered. 23 separate incidents where we somehow had advance information that saved lives. When I tried to dig deeper, I hit classified walls everywhere. But I knew someone had to be behind it. Someone had paid a terrible price to give us that advantage. She paused, emotion thick in her voice. Of those operations that succeeded because of your intelligence, it rescued my brother. He was a Marine taken hostage in Lebanon. Because of the ghost, because of you, we knew where he was being held. We got him out. He's alive today because of you. He has 3 grandchildren now. Maggie's hand went to her mouth. I didn't know. I never knew what happened after I got the information out. They didn't tell me which operations succeeded, which ones. Which ones failed, the Admiral finished quietly. They isolated you, even in your success. That's standard procedure in intelligence work, but it's also cruel. I need to call my brother, Chen said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. He needs to know. He spent 37 years wondering who saved his life. As Chen stepped away to make her call, other people in the small crowd began to murmur. An older man cleared his throat. My son was in Beirut in 1987, Marine Embassy Guard. He always said they got intelligence that prevented an attack on the embassy, said it saved dozens of lives. A woman raised her hand tentatively. My husband was Navy, stationed on a ship in the Mediterranean. They got warning about a planned attack at port, changed their schedule because of intelligence reports. Could that have been? I don't know, Maggie said honestly. I passed along everything I learned, everything I could piece together, but I never knew what they did with the information. Admiral Hawthorne looked around at the group, at the growing realization of just how many lives this quiet woman had touched. This is why your story matters, he said to Maggie. Not for glory, not for recognition, but so people understand what real service looks like. So they understand that heroes don't always wear uniforms and medals. Sometimes they work 3 jobs in rural Georgia and drive 12 hours to see their son graduate. Patricia had tears streaming down her face. I was so horrible to you, she said. I judged you based on your clothes, your car, the fact that you came alone. I'm ashamed. Don't be, Maggie said kindly. We live in a world that measures worth in all the wrong ways. You're not the first person to make assumptions about me, and you won't be the last, but you apologized, and that takes courage too. Richard stepped forward. Ms. Rivera, my company, I'm a defense contractor. We have a veterans assistance program. We help vets who fell through the cracks get the benefits and care they deserve. I'd like to offer our services to you pro bono. We can help navigate the bureaucracy, file appeals, whatever it takes. That's very kind, Maggie said, genuinely touched. I may take you up on that. Charles looked at Daniel. Your mom is amazing. I've been bragging all year about my family's military tradition, but it pales in comparison to what she did. She is amazing, Daniel agreed. I just wish I'd known sooner. I wish a lot of things, Maggie said softly. But dwelling on wishes doesn't change anything. We have to move forward with what we have. Commander Chen returned, her face flushed. I just spoke to my brother. He wants to meet you. He's in Virginia. We could arrange something if you're willing. Maggie looked overwhelmed. I don't know. This is all happening so fast. Mom, you don't have to decide anything right now, Daniel said protectively. Today is supposed to be a happy day. Let's just enjoy it, okay? Admiral Hawthorne nodded. The young man is right. We've ambushed you with this when you came here for a celebration. Forgive us." He straightened and addressed the group. "I think we should give Ms. Rivera and her son some space, but before we go I want to say one more thing." He turned back to Maggie. "For 40 years I've carried guilt about what happened to you, about the fact that you saved my life and the lives of my team and the system threw you away. About the fact that I didn't have the rank or the courage to fight for you when it mattered. I can't give you those years back, but I can give you my word that I will fight for you now, whether you want me to or not. You deserve better than what you got." "Admiral," Maggie said, standing up with some difficulty, Daniel steadying her, "you don't owe me anything. You didn't make the decisions that determined my fate. You were just a lieutenant commander following orders, same as I was following orders." "But I'm not a lieutenant commander anymore," Hawthorne replied. "I'm an admiral, and I have the power to change things. That's what rank is supposed to be for, protecting the people who can't protect themselves, fighting for those who have already fought too much." The two veterans looked at each other, decades of unspoken words passing between them. Finally, Maggie nodded. "Then I won't try to stop you, but I want to be involved in the decisions. If my story is going to come out, I want to control how it's told, and I want protection for the people who helped me or their families if they're gone." "Done," the Admiral said immediately. "Anything you want you'll have, that's a promise." As the group began to disperse, people coming up one by one to shake Maggie's hand or offer words of thanks, Daniel stood close to his mother. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. "Tired," Maggie admitted, "but also lighter somehow. I've carried this alone for so long. Having people know, having people understand, it's strange, but it helps." "I'm sorry I didn't know," Daniel said. "I'm sorry you had to carry it alone." "Oh, honey, I was never alone," Maggie said, cupping his face. "I had you. You were the light that got me through every dark day. Every sacrifice was worth it to see you become the man you are now." Patricia approached one last time. "Ms. Rivera, I was wondering, Richard and I are hosting a lunch for Charles and some of the other graduates and their families. We would be honored if you and Daniel would join us." Maggie started to politely decline. She'd never been comfortable in social situations like that, but Daniel squeezed her hand. "That would be nice, Mom. You haven't eaten since yesterday and we should celebrate." "Then we'd be happy to accept," Maggie said, making Patricia beam. As they walked toward the parking area, Maggie leaned on Daniel more than she'd like to admit. The morning had taken its toll on her physically and emotionally, but for the first time in decades, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the weight she'd been carrying might finally start to lighten. She didn't know yet that the real surprises were still to come. The lunch was held at the Moreland home, a sprawling colonial in one of Annapolis's most prestigious neighborhoods. Maggie felt out of place the moment they pulled up, her old Honda looking shabby next to the luxury cars lining the circular driveway. But Daniel parked proudly and came around to help her out. "You belong here as much as anyone," he whispered. "More than most, actually." Inside, the house was everything Maggie had expected. High ceilings, expensive furniture, catered food laid out on tables that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But Patricia and Richard had clearly spread the word about who Maggie was, because the other families present treated her with a respect that made her uncomfortable. "Ms. Rivera, thank you for your service," seemed to be the phrase of the day, repeated by person after person. Maggie accepted each with grace, but she could see Daniel watching her, noticing how exhausting she found all the attention. About an hour into the lunch, a man arrived who caused a stir among the guests. He was in his 70s, walking with a slight limp but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Commander Chen had come with him. "Maggie," Chen said, pulling her aside, "this is my brother Marcus Chen. He insisted on coming. I hope that's okay." Marcus looked at Maggie with eyes that were swimming in tears. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I don't even know what to say except thank you. It's not enough, but thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Maggie said, but Marcus shook his head. "Yes, I do. I need you to understand what your sacrifice meant." He pulled out his phone and showed her pictures. "This is my daughter Rachel. This is her son Marcus Jr., named after me. And this is little Emma, who just turned 3. None of them would exist if you hadn't endured what you endured. My entire line, my family's future, it exists because you suffered." Maggie looked at the pictures of smiling faces, at the generations that had come from this one man's survival, and felt something break open in her chest. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "I want to do something for you," Marcus said urgently. "Anything, name it. My sister said you work multiple jobs, that you struggle financially. I run a consulting firm. We place veterans in high-level positions, or I have money. I could help." "That's very kind," Maggie said, "but I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Marcus insisted. "It's a debt, one I can never truly repay." Before Maggie could respond, there was a commotion at the front door. Admiral Hawthorne had arrived, and he wasn't alone. He'd brought two men in suits, clearly government officials of some kind, and a woman carrying a large briefcase. Richard hurried to greet them, and Maggie felt a sense of foreboding. Something was happening, something bigger than a simple lunch celebration. Admiral Hawthorne found Maggie in the crowd. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, "but something's come up that you need to know about. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Patricia immediately offered her husband's study, and soon Maggie found herself seated in a leather chair with Daniel standing protectively behind her, facing the Admiral and the officials he'd brought. "Ms. Rivera," one of the suited men began, "I'm Deputy Director Thomas Brennan from Naval Intelligence. The Admiral contacted us this morning about your case, and we've been doing some digging." "What kind of digging?" Maggie asked cautiously. The woman with the briefcase, who introduced herself as Lieutenant Commander Jane Parrish, a Navy lawyer, opened it and pulled out several folders. "When we started pulling your files to review for the benefits case, we found some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" Daniel asked. Brennan exchanged a look with Hawthorne before continuing. "Your early retirement wasn't processed normally. Usually when an intelligence officer is given early retirement, there's a standard set of procedures: exit interviews, debriefings, evaluation of potential ongoing threats. None of that happened in your case." "I was debriefed," Maggie said slowly. "Extensively. They asked me hundreds of questions." "Yes, but those debriefing reports were sealed under a classification level that's unusual even for sensitive operations," Parrish explained. "And the person who ordered that seal was Captain Thomas Westbrook, who at the time was the head of your division." Maggie went very still. "Captain Westbrook died years ago." "In 1995, Brennan confirmed. "But before he died, he made some interesting decisions about your case. He's the one who pushed for your early retirement. He's the one who sealed your records, and he's the one who blocked several attempts by other officers, including then Commander Hawthorne, to have you considered for valor awards." "Why would he do that?" Daniel asked. "What reason would he have?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Brennan said. "But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, a former CIA analyst published a memoir about intelligence operations in the 1980s. In it, she mentioned something called Operation Copper Shield, the operation you were part of, Ms. Rivera. She doesn't name names, but she suggests there was intelligence that the operation was compromised from the inside." Maggie's hands had started to shake. "You think Captain Westbrook was the leak?" "We think it's possible," Hawthorne said gently. "It would explain a lot. Why he was so eager to get you out of the service, why he buried your records, why he refused to let anyone look too closely at what happened. If he was the one who compromised the operation, then you were a liability. You were the evidence that could destroy him." "But you said he died in 1995, Daniel pointed out. "Why does any of this matter now?" "Because if we can prove it, we can clear your mother's record of any implication that she was somehow at fault for her cover being blown," Parrish explained. "Right now, the official reports suggest she made an operational error that exposed her identity. That's not true. We know she was compromised by a leak, but proving it means she's entitled to additional compensation, full benefits, and potentially awards that were denied her." Maggie felt like the room was spinning. "I was blamed. All this time, the official record said it was my fault." "Not explicitly," Brennan said carefully, "but the language in the reports suggests operational mistakes on your part. Westbrook wrote those reports. If he was the leak, he had every reason to shift blame onto you." "That son of a bitch," Daniel said, his voice shaking with anger. "He betrayed my mother and then destroyed her career to cover it up." "We don't have proof yet," Hawthorne cautioned. "But we're going to find it." I've already called in favors from 3 different agencies. We're going to go through every file, every record, every piece of paper connected to Operation Copper Shield and Thomas Westbrook. Maggie stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, she could see the other lunch guests mingling on the patio, oblivious to the conversation happening inside. I accepted what happened, she said quietly. I made peace with it. I didn't think I'd made mistakes. I knew I'd been careful, but I told myself that in intelligence work, sometimes careful isn't enough. Sometimes bad luck gets you. I never imagined. Daniel went to her. Mom, this could change everything. If they can prove Westbrook was the leak, you could get justice. Justice, Maggie repeated the word bitterly. What does justice even look like after 40 years? Westbrook is dead. The people I was trying to protect are probably dead. The only people this really helps is me, and I've already survived without it. But you shouldn't have had to just survive, Hawthorne said intensely. You should have been honored, promoted, given the support you deserved. Instead, you've spent decades working yourself to exhaustion while suffering from injuries sustained in service to your country. Injuries you got because someone on our side betrayed you. If this is true, Parrish added, Westbrook's family has been receiving his full pension and benefits all these years. His widow, his children, they've benefited from his 30-year career while you've struggled. Something in that statement cut through Maggie's numbness. She turned from the window. His family doesn't know anything about this, do they? His children grew up believing their father was a hero. Probably, Brennan admitted. Then maybe we should leave it alone, Maggie said. Why destroy his legacy? Why hurt people who had nothing to do with what he did? Because the truth matters, Daniel said fiercely. Mom, you've protected everyone else your whole life. You protected me by not telling me about your service. You protected Westbrook's reputation by not fighting back. You protected the system by going quietly. When do you get to stop protecting everyone else? Maggie looked at her son, seeing in his face an anger she'd rarely seen before. He was furious on her behalf, ready to fight battles she'd never fought for herself. Your son is right, Marcus Chen said from the doorway. No one had noticed him and his sister enter the study. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the door was open. Ms. Rivera, you saved my life. But from what I'm hearing, someone set you up to die. That person should be held accountable, even if it's just in the historical record. I agree, Commander Sarah Chen added. I worked in intelligence for 10 years. If there was a mole in our ranks, especially one who betrayed his own people, that needs to be documented. Not just for you, but for everyone, to know that the system will seek justice even decades later. Admiral Hawthorne stood and walked over to Maggie. I understand your hesitation. I understand not wanting to hurt innocent people. But consider this. What if Westbrook betrayed others too? What if there are other operations that failed, other lives that were lost because of him? Uncovering the truth about his actions might give closure to other families, might answer questions people have been carrying for decades. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of another impossible decision. When she opened them again, she looked at each person in the room. The admiral who'd carried guilt for 40 years, the lawyer ready to fight for her, the intelligence officer seeking truth, the man whose life she'd saved, his sister who'd spent years wondering about the ghost, and her son who was only now learning the full cost of his mother's service. All right, she said finally. Let's find the truth, but I want something in return. Name it, Brennan said immediately. If we prove Westbrook was the leak, I want any other operations he was involved in reviewed. I want to know if there are other people who suffered because of him. And if there are, I want them to get the justice I'm getting. This isn't just about me. Admiral Hawthorne smiled. That's exactly what I would expect you to say, and I promise you we'll do exactly that. Parrish made notes in a legal pad. I'll need to debrief you extensively, she told Maggie. Everything you remember about the operation, about Westbrook, about what happened. It could take days. I have time, Maggie said. I took the whole week off work to be here for Daniel's graduation, though I should probably call my bosses and let them know I might need more than a week. Your jobs, Richard said, appearing in the doorway. He'd apparently been listening too. How many do you work? 3, Maggie admitted. Cashier at a grocery store, night shift cleaning at an office building, and weekend receptionist at a veterinary clinic. The room fell silent. These people with comfortable lives, military pensions, successful careers, were confronted with the reality of what happened to heroes when the system failed them. That ends now, Admiral Hawthorne said firmly. Even before we resolve the Westbrook situation, your benefits should be adjusted. You're entitled to medical care through the VA, disability payments for injuries sustained in service, and other support. Lieutenant Commander Parrish, make that your first priority. Already on it, sir, she replied, fingers flying over her phone screen. Richard stepped fully into the room. And the offer I made earlier about my company's Veterans Assistance Program, that still stands. We have lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of case. They can work with the Navy's legal team to make sure you get everything you're entitled to. I'll cover her housing costs, Marcus Chen said suddenly. I'm sorry, but I can't stand the thought of you living in some tiny apartment and working 3 jobs after what you did for me. At least let me provide you with a decent place to live, rent-free, while all this gets sorted out. That's too much, Maggie protested. It's not enough, Marcus countered. It will never be enough, but it's what I can do. Daniel's eyes were shining with tears. Mom, let them help, please. You've been alone in this fight for so long, you don't have to be anymore. Maggie looked around at all these people, some she'd known for hours, some for decades, all ready to fight for her. It was overwhelming and terrifying, and more than she'd ever expected when she'd driven through the night to watch her son graduate. Okay, she whispered. Okay, thank you, all of you. The room erupted in relieved smiles and plans being made. But Maggie noticed Admiral Hawthorne had pulled out his phone and was reading something with a frown. What is it? She asked. He looked up, his expression troubled. I just got a message from a colleague at the Pentagon. Someone's been asking questions about Operation Copper Shield, someone who doesn't have clearance. Who? Brennan demanded. That's the thing, Hawthorne said slowly. They don't know. Whoever it is has been using channels that obscure their identity. But they've been digging into the same files we have, and they started asking questions yesterday, before I ever called the Secretary of the Navy. A chill ran through the room. Someone else was investigating Operation Copper Shield. The question was, were they looking for the same truth or trying to bury it? The mood in Richard Morelland's study shifted from determined to tense. Admiral Hawthorne was on his phone again, speaking in clipped tones to someone at the Pentagon. Deputy Director Brennan had opened his laptop and was typing rapidly, accessing databases that probably required several layers of security clearance. Who would be looking into this now? Commander Sarah Chen asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. After 40 years, why would someone suddenly start digging? Could be coincidence, Lieutenant Commander Parrish suggested, but her tone said she didn't believe it. The CIA analyst's memoir came out 3 months ago. Maybe someone else read it and got curious. Or, Maggie said quietly, drawing everyone's attention, someone got nervous that the memoir would lead to questions. Captain Westbrook is dead, but that doesn't mean he acted alone. Daniel moved closer to his mother protectively. You think there were others involved in compromising the operation? Intelligence work is rarely a solo act, Brennan said, looking up from his laptop. If Westbrook was leaking information, he was leaking it to someone. That someone might still be alive, and they'd have every reason to keep the truth buried. Admiral Hawthorne ended his call and turned to the group. My contact at the Pentagon is tracking the inquiries. They originated from multiple sources. A Freedom of Information Act request filed by a journalist, database searches from what appears to be a private investigator, and some inquiries that came through official channels but were rooted in ways that obscure who actually initiated them. Someone's covering their tracks, Sarah Chen observed. Or someone is trying to build a case without alerting the people they're investigating, Maggie said. She'd moved to sit down again, and Daniel noticed she was rubbing her hands, a sign that the arthritis was bothering her, which usually meant she was stressed. If I wanted to investigate something without tipping off potential targets, I'd use multiple sources and routes too. That's a good point, Brennan acknowledged. The question is whether we're looking at an ally or an adversary. Richard, who'd been quiet, spoke up. Forgive me if this is naive, but does it matter? If multiple people are investigating, doesn't that just mean the truth will come out faster? It matters if the investigation gets compromised, Parrish explained. If someone knows they're being investigated, they have time to destroy evidence, create false trails, or disappear. In intelligence matters, timing is everything. Admiral Hawthorne's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen and his eyebrows shot up. "It's the Secretary of the Navy. I need to take this." He stepped out of the room. In his absence, an uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Maggie closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. This morning she'd been worried about finding a good parking spot and seeing her son graduate. Now she was caught in the middle of an investigation into 40-year-old betrayals, with unknown parties potentially working either for or against her interests. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside her chair. "Just tired, honey. This is a lot." Marcus Chen pulled up a chair. "Ms. Rivera, I don't want to overstep, but have you eaten today? Really eaten, not just picked at the lunch buffet?" Maggie smiled weakly. "I'm not much hungry when I'm stressed." "I'm the same way," Marcus said. "But my doctor says that's when we need food most. Sarah, could you ask Patricia for some tea and maybe some crackers or something light?" As Sarah left to do that, Marcus continued in a gentle voice. "I want you to know something. When I was held captive, and I know my experience doesn't compare to yours, you were held much longer and under worse conditions. But when I was there, I used to imagine the people who were working to find me. I'd picture them as these larger-than-life figures, superheroes almost. It helped me stay hopeful." He paused, looking at Maggie with tears in his eyes. "And now I find out that one of those people was real, was you. But you're not a superhero. You're a person who's worked 3 jobs and driven 12 hours to see her son graduate. Somehow that makes what you did even more incredible, because you're real, your suffering was real, your sacrifice was real." "I don't feel incredible," Maggie admitted. "I feel like I'm in over my head." "Then we'll help you swim," Marcus said simply. Admiral Hawthorne returned, and his expression was serious but not grim. That was enlightening. "The Secretary has been getting inquiries too, from several members of Congress, from the Office of Naval Intelligence Inspector General, and from the Department of Defense Historical Advisory Committee." "All about Operation Copper Shield?" Brennan asked. "Not specifically. They're asking about declassification of 1980s intelligence operations in general, but the timing is suspicious. And here's the interesting part. One of the congressional inquiries came from Senator Rebecca Westbrook of Virginia." Maggie's eyes flew open. "Westbrook, as in Thomas Westbrook's daughter," Hawthorne confirmed. "She was elected to the Senate 2 years ago. According to the Secretary, her office has been pushing for declassification of her father's service records." The room processed this information. Finally, Daniel said, "So she's investigating her own father. Why?" "I might have an answer to that," Parrish said, looking at her phone. "I just did a quick search. Senator Westbrook gave an interview last month where she talked about her father's legacy. She said that he'd never talked much about his service, and that when he died, most of his records were sealed. She wants to write a biography of him but can't access the information she needs." "So she doesn't know," Sarah Chen said. "She thinks she's honoring her father by pushing for declassification. But if those records are declassified," Maggie said slowly, "and if we can prove what her father did, it would destroy his reputation and potentially hurt her political career," Brennan finished. "She's a rising star in her party. Being the daughter of a traitor, even one from 4 decades ago, could end that." Maggie stood up abruptly, ignoring the pain in her joints. "We need to contact her. Before this goes any further, she needs to know what she might uncover." "Mom, she's not your responsibility," Daniel protested. "Her father betrayed you. He's the reason you were tortured, the reason you lost your career. You don't owe his daughter anything." "Maybe not," Maggie said, "but I know what it's like to have your life turned upside down by classified operations and secrets. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, even the daughter of the man who betrayed me." Admiral Hawthorne studied her for a long moment. "You want to warn her, give her a chance to prepare before the truth comes out." "I want to give her a choice," Maggie corrected. "Right now she's pushing for declassification without knowing what it might reveal. She should know what she's potentially unleashing for her own sake and for her family's sake." "That's incredibly generous," Richard said, "given what her father did to you." "Children shouldn't suffer for their parents' sins," Maggie said firmly. "I've spent my whole life making sure Daniel never had to carry the weight of what happened to me. Why would I want Senator Westbrook to carry that weight if it can be avoided?" "Because she's a senator with resources and power," Brennan pointed out. If she knows the truth, she might try to bury it. She could use her influence to keep the records sealed. Then we'd deal with that, Maggie said. But I'd rather give her the chance to do the right thing than assume the worst of her. Admiral Hawthorne smiled. You know, this is exactly why you were such an exceptional intelligence officer. You always saw the human element, even in impossible situations. He pulled out his phone. I have contacts in Senator Westbrook's office. I can arrange a meeting. Wait, Parrish said. If we do this, we need to be strategic. Senator Westbrook shouldn't learn about this from a phone call. This needs to be handled carefully. What do you suggest? Hawthorne asked. A private meeting, tomorrow if possible. We present her with what we know, what we suspect, and what the investigation might reveal. We give her time to process, and then we let her decide how she wants to proceed. And if she chooses to fight the investigation, Brennan asked. If she uses her position to protect her father's reputation, Maggie looked him straight in the eye. Then we continue anyway. I'm not suggesting we give her veto power over the truth. I'm suggesting we give her advance warning and a chance to be part of the solution instead of an obstacle. Sarah returned with tea and crackers, and Patricia followed with a full tray of sandwiches and fruit. I heard you all might need sustenance for a long discussion, Patricia said, setting the tray down. And I want to say, Ms. Rivera, the way you're handling this, thinking about Senator Westbrook's feelings even after what her father did, it's remarkable. It's just human decency, Maggie said, accepting a cup of tea gratefully. No, Patricia said firmly, it's more than that, it's grace, real, genuine grace, and it's teaching all of us something. Over the next hour, they hammered out a plan. Admiral Hawthorne would contact Senator Westbrook's office and request a private meeting under the guise of discussing veterans' affairs. He would bring Maggie, Parrish, and Brennan. They would present the situation honestly and give the senator 24 hours to decide how she wanted to proceed. As the meeting was breaking up and people were preparing to return to the lunch gathering on the patio, Marcus Chen pulled Maggie aside. I meant what I said about housing. My company owns several properties. I have a small house in Virginia, about 20 minutes from here, that's currently vacant. It's yours for as long as you need it. Marcus, I can't. Yes, you can, he interrupted gently. Please, let me do this one thing. You gave me my life. Let me give you a home. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. That's very kind. It's not kind, it's necessary. You've been struggling for too long. That ends now. He pulled out a business card and wrote on the back. This is my personal cell number. Call me after your meeting tomorrow and we'll arrange everything. As Marcus walked away, Daniel came to stand beside his mother. How are you really doing with all this? Maggie thought about the question. 24 hours ago, she'd been a woman with 3 jobs, arthritis, and a son she was proud of. Now she was at the center of a decades-old investigation, being offered homes and legal representation, facing the possibility of finally getting recognition for service she'd long since made peace with being forgotten. Honestly, I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to just get in my car and drive back to Georgia and pretend none of this happened. But another part, a part I thought I'd buried years ago, that part wants justice. Not revenge, just acknowledgement, recognition that what happened to me mattered. It did matter, Daniel said fiercely. And it still matters. These people you saved, the operations you made possible, that all mattered. And the fact that you were betrayed and cast aside, that matters too. I know, Maggie said softly. I'm just not sure I'm ready for what comes next. Once we meet with Senator Westbrook, once we start this process, there's no going back. My quiet life ends. But maybe a better life begins, Daniel suggested. Maggie smiled at her son. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher, he replied, hugging her. They returned to the patio where the lunch had evolved into a full-fledged gathering. Charles Morellan was regaling a group with stories from the academy, but he stopped when he saw Maggie and Daniel emerge. Everything okay? He asked. Getting there, Daniel said. Charles lowered his voice. Look, I know I don't really know you guys, but what your mom did, what she survived, it puts everything in perspective. I've been bragging about my family's military service, but it was always safe service, prestigious positions. Your mom actually bled for her country. That's real. Thanks, Daniel said, clearly moved. As the afternoon wore on, Maggie found herself surrounded by people who wanted to hear her story, to express their gratitude, to offer help. It was overwhelming but also healing in a way she hadn't expected. For 40 years, she'd been silent. Now, people were listening. But in the back of her mind, she kept thinking about tomorrow's meeting with Senator Westbrook. That conversation would determine not just her own future, but potentially the reputation of a dead man and the career of his daughter. Maggie had faced down terrorists and survived torture, but somehow, the thought of sitting across from Rebecca Westbrook and telling her that her father had been a traitor, that was terrifying in a completely different way. As the sun began to set over Annapolis, casting golden light across the patio, Admiral Hawthorne approached Maggie one more time. "I got confirmation," he said quietly. "Senator Westbrook will meet with us tomorrow at 2 p.m. at her office in D.C. I didn't tell her staff what it was about, just that it concerned her father's service record." Maggie nodded, her stomach tightening. "Then I guess we're really doing this." "We're really doing this," Hawthorne confirmed. "But Maggie, you don't have to be the one to tell her. I can do it." "No," Maggie said firmly. "If we're asking her to face the truth about her father, the least I can do is look her in the eye when we tell her. She deserves that much." The Admiral smiled sadly. "You're a better person than most, you know that." "I'm just a person who's made a lot of mistakes and tried to learn from them," Maggie replied. But as she said it, she wondered what Rebecca Westbrook would think tomorrow when she learned about her father's biggest mistake, and how it had destroyed the life of the woman sitting across from her. The truth was coming, whether any of them were ready for it or not. Senator Rebecca Westbrook's office in Washington, D.C. was everything Maggie expected: polished, professional, filled with photos of the senator with various dignitaries and military personnel. What Maggie didn't expect was how young she looked. At 47, Rebecca was a striking woman with her father's sharp features but warmer eyes. "Admiral Hawthorne, it's good to see you again," Rebecca said, shaking his hand before turning to the others. "And you've brought colleagues." "Senator, thank you for making time on short notice," Hawthorne said. "This is Deputy Director Thomas Brennan from Naval Intelligence, Lieutenant Commander Jane Parrish from the Navy's Legal Department, and this is Margaret Rivera." Rebecca shook everyone's hands, but Maggie noticed the slight pause when she got to her, a flicker of confusion, perhaps at seeing someone so plainly dressed among the officials in their uniforms and suits. "Please sit," Rebecca gestured to the conference table in her office. "Your message said this was about my father's service record." "It is," Hawthorne said, "but it's complicated. Senator, before we begin, I need to ask, how much do you know about Operation Copper Shield?" Rebecca frowned. "Operation Copper Shield? I've never heard of it. Is that something my father was involved in?" "He was in charge of it," Brennan said. "It was a joint intelligence operation in 1987, focused on preventing terrorist attacks against U.S. assets in the Mediterranean theater." 1987, Rebecca said thoughtfully. "I was 9 years old. That was when Dad was stationed overseas and we didn't see him for almost 2 years. He never talked about what he did during that time." "There's a reason for that," Hawthorne said carefully. "Senator, what we're about to tell you is difficult. Some of it is still classified, though we're working on declassification. But you deserve to know the truth before it becomes public." Rebecca's expression became guarded. "What truth?" Maggie spoke for the first time. "Senator Westbrook, my name is Margaret Rivera. In 1987, I was a naval intelligence officer working under your father's command as part of Operation Copper Shield." Recognition flickered in Rebecca's eyes. "Rivera, you're the one who's been asking for my father's records to be unsealed." "No, ma'am," Maggie said gently. "That was you. You've been pushing for declassification so you could write a biography of your father." "That's right," Rebecca said slowly. "But what does that have to do with you?" "Everything," Maggie said. "Senator, in 1987, I was operating undercover in Beirut, gathering intelligence on terrorist cells planning attacks against U.S. interests. The operation was highly classified. Only a handful of people knew I was there and what my mission was." She paused, and Parrish opened a folder, sliding a document across the table. Rebecca picked it up, scanning it quickly. "This is a mission report from Operation Copper Shield," Parrish explained. "It details how Lieutenant Rivera's cover was compromised in July 1987, leading to her capture by a terrorist cell." Rebecca's face went pale as she read. "Captured? You were taken prisoner?" For 6 months, Maggie confirmed. During that time, I was interrogated and tortured for information about American operations in the region. Oh my God, Rebecca whispered. She looked up at Maggie with horror. I'm so sorry, I can't imagine. The official reports at the time blamed operational errors for the compromise, Brennan continued. Those reports were written by your father. They suggested Lieutenant Rivera had made mistakes that exposed her identity. Rebecca's hands tightened on the document. But that's not what happened. We don't believe so, Hawthorne said. We believe Lieutenant Rivera was compromised by a leak from within the operation itself. We believe that leak came from your father. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca stared at them, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and confusion. That's impossible, she finally said. My father was a decorated officer. He served for 30 years with distinction. He would never, Senator, we're not saying this lightly, Parrish interjected. We've been reviewing the evidence, and there are significant inconsistencies in your father's reports and actions during that period. Brennan slid another folder across the table. These are financial records from 1987. Your father made several large deposits into an offshore account during the months of Operation Copper Shield. The total amount was roughly equivalent to $200,000 in 1987 money, about $500,000 today. Lots of military families use offshore accounts, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. Not for amounts like this, Brennan said, and not with transactions timed to coincide with intelligence leaks that led to terrorist attacks. Rebecca looked down at the financial records, then at the mission reports, then at Maggie. You believe my father sold you out? That he took money to betray his own people? We believe it's possible, Hawthorne said carefully. We're not certain yet, that's why we're here, to tell you what we're investigating before you push for declassification that will make all of this public. And to give you a choice, Maggie added softly. Rebecca's eyes snapped to her. What choice? You can ask us to stop, Maggie said. You can use your influence to keep these records sealed. You can protect your father's reputation and your own career. No one would blame you. Except I would, Rebecca said sharply. Ms. Rivera, if what you're saying is true, if my father really did what you're accusing him of, then you suffered because of him. You were tortured because he betrayed you. Her voice broke slightly. Why would you give me the option to cover that up? Because you're not responsible for what your father did, Maggie said. Because I have a son, and I know I would want someone to protect him if I'd done something terrible. Because your father is dead and can't defend himself, but you're alive and you've built a career on his legacy. Because, she paused, because I believe in giving people choices when I can. Rebecca stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to the group. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. My whole life, I've admired my father. I became a senator partly because of him, because of what I thought he represented. I've given speeches about his service, written about his dedication. If this is true, it would be devastating, Hawthorne said gently. We understand that. Do you? Rebecca turned back to face them, tears streaming down her face. My father died when I was 16. I never really got to know him as an adult. The man I've been honoring, writing about, building my career on, what if he never existed? What if he was always a traitor? Maggie stood and crossed to the window. Senator, may I tell you something? Rebecca nodded, wiping her eyes. When I was captured, when I was being tortured, I thought about my unborn child. I didn't even know I was pregnant yet, but somehow my body knew. And I promised myself that if I survived, I would make sure my son never knew about this darkness. I would give him a normal life, a good life, free from the shadow of what happened to me. She paused, glancing back at where Daniel had entered the room with one of Rebecca's aides. He'd been waiting outside but had apparently been invited in. My son graduated from the Naval Academy yesterday, Maggie continued. He's following in my footsteps, joining the Navy, and until yesterday he didn't know about Operation Copper Shield. He didn't know about the torture, the betrayal, any of it. I kept it from him because I wanted to protect him. But yesterday it all came out, Daniel added, stepping forward. And you know what? I wish she'd told me sooner. Not because I needed to carry her burden, but because understanding her sacrifice made me understand her strength. It gave me a legacy to live up to, not a perfect legacy, but a real one. Rebecca looked at Daniel, then back at Maggie. What are you saying? I'm saying that the truth is complicated, Maggie said. Your father did something terrible if the evidence we're gathering proves what we suspect, but that doesn't erase whatever good he did in your life. It doesn't mean the man who was your father never existed. People are complicated. They can do both terrible things and loving things. They can betray their country and still love their daughter. How can you be so understanding? Rebecca asked. After what he did to you. Because I've had 40 years to process it, Maggie said. You're getting all of this dumped on you at once. I'm trying to give you the space I didn't have. Rebecca returned to her seat, pulling herself together with visible effort. What exactly do you need from me? Your cooperation, Brennan said, or at least your non-interference. We're going to continue investigating Operation Copper Shield. We're going to seek declassification of the relevant documents. When we do, your father's actions, both good and bad, will become part of the public record. And if you're wrong, Rebecca asked, if you investigate and find out he was innocent, then we'll make sure that's part of the public record too, Hawthorne promised. Senator, I served with your father. I respected him. I don't want him to be guilty any more than you do. But if he is, the truth needs to come out. Not just for Lieutenant Rivera's sake, but for anyone else who might have been affected by his actions. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, tell me everything. Every detail of what you know, what you suspect, what you're investigating. I want to understand all of it before I make any decisions. For the next 2 hours, they laid it all out. The mission reports, the financial records, the pattern of intelligence leaks, the testimony from other officers who'd been part of Operation Copper Shield. They showed Rebecca the medical reports from Maggie's rescue, the documentation of her injuries, the abbreviated career that followed. Rebecca listened to it all, asking sharp questions that showed why she'd been successful in politics. She wasn't trying to poke holes in their case out of defense. She was trying to understand the truth. When they finished, Rebecca sat back in her chair. I need some time, she said finally. It's a lot. Of course, Hawthorne said, we understand. But I want to say something before you leave. Rebecca looked directly at Maggie. Ms. Rivera, regardless of what my father did or didn't do, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry you were betrayed, sorry you were tortured, sorry you lost your career and suffered for decades while working multiple jobs. None of that should have happened. Thank you, Maggie said quietly. And I want you to know, if the investigation proves my father was responsible, I won't stand in the way of the truth. I won't use my position to protect his reputation at the expense of justice. Rebecca's voice was firm despite the tears still visible in her eyes. My father taught me that integrity matters. If he failed to live up to that standard himself, then the least I can do is honor it now. Admiral Hawthorne stood. Senator, that takes courage, real courage. It's just what's right, Rebecca said, which is apparently something I learned from my father even if he didn't always follow his own lessons. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca stopped Maggie at the door. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you hate him, my father? Maggie thought about it carefully. I did for a while. But hate is exhausting and I had a son to raise, so I let it go. I made peace with what happened and moved forward. Your father made choices that hurt me terribly, but holding onto that hurt would have only damaged me further. You're remarkable, Rebecca said softly. I'm just someone who survived, Maggie replied. Like a lot of people. In the car ride back to Annapolis, the group was quiet. Finally, Daniel spoke up from the back seat. She took that better than I expected. She's a strong woman, Parrish observed. She'll get through this. Will she, though? Daniel asked. Finding out your father was a traitor, how do you recover from that? The same way you recover from anything, Maggie said, looking out the window at the passing scenery. One day at a time, with support from people who care about you. By finding meaning in the parts of your life you can control. Hawthorne glanced at her from the driver's seat. You're still worried about her. I'm worried about everyone involved in this, Maggie admitted. The truth is going to hurt a lot of people. Westbrook's family, the other officers who trusted him, the people who have spent decades believing a lie. Truth isn't always clean and simple. Sometimes it's messy and painful. But necessary, Brennan added. The truth is always necessary. They arrived back at the hotel where Admiral Hawthorne had arranged rooms for Maggie and Daniel. As they were checking in, Maggie's phone rang. It was Marcus Chen. Margaret, I hope I'm not interrupting, he said. I just wanted to let you know I've arranged everything for the house in Virginia. It's ready whenever you want to move in." "Marcus, you really didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he interrupted gently. "And there's something else. I talked to my company's HR department. We have a position opening in our Veterans Support Program. It's not charity, it's a real job with real responsibilities. But it's also work that would put your experience and intelligence and your understanding of what veterans go through to good use. Would you be interested?" Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Marcus replied. "You don't have to decide now. But Maggie, you've spent 40 years working jobs that were beneath your capabilities. You deserve work that matters, that uses your skills, that pays you what you're worth." After she hung up, Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. "You okay, Mom?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything's changing so fast. Yesterday I was just a woman with 3 jobs. Now I have people offering me houses and careers and—" "Justice," Daniel finished. "Maybe," Maggie said. "We'll see." That evening, Admiral Hawthorne called with news. "Senator Westbrook just released a statement," he said, reading from his phone. She announced that she's sponsoring legislation to review cases of intelligence officers from the 1980s and 1990s who may have been denied proper recognition and benefits. She specifically mentions Operation Copper Shield, though she doesn't name names yet. "She's getting ahead of it," Brennan said, having joined them for dinner. "Smart. She's controlling the narrative before someone else can." "And she's doing the right thing," Maggie added, "turning her father's betrayal into something positive." 2 weeks later, Maggie stood in the living room of the small house Marcus had given her in Virginia. It was modest but comfortable, more space than she'd had in years. Through the window, she could see Daniel's car pull up. He was coming to help her unpack the few belongings she'd brought from Georgia. But there was another car with him. Admiral Hawthorne emerged, along with Lieutenant Commander Parrish. "We have news," Hawthorne said when they came inside. "The investigation found enough evidence. Captain Westbrook was definitely leaking intelligence to a terrorist cell in exchange for money. We've identified at least 6 separate instances where his leaks led directly to compromised operations." "How many people died?" Maggie asked quietly. "We're still determining that," Parrish said gently. "But it's significant. You weren't his only victim, Maggie. There were others. And the good news," Hawthorne continued, "is that the Secretary of the Navy has approved a complete review of your case. Full back pay for the career you should have had, adjustment of your pension, medical benefits, and—" he paused, emotion evident in his voice. "And we're recommending you for the Navy Cross for your actions during Operation Copper Shield." Maggie sat down abruptly. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. "I don't need a medal," she whispered. "But you deserve one," Hawthorne said. "What you did, continuing to transmit intelligence even while being tortured, protecting your sources even under duress, surviving 6 months of captivity while pregnant, that's extraordinary valor. The country needs to know about it." Daniel knelt beside his mother's chair. "Mom, it's okay to accept this. It's okay to let people honor what you did." Maggie looked at her son, at the admiral who'd carried guilt for 40 years, at the lawyer who'd fought for her case. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." 6 months later, Maggie stood in the East Room of the White House, wearing a new dress that Patricia Morelland had insisted on buying for her. Daniel stood beside her in his dress uniform, holding her hand. Around them were Marcus and Sarah Chen, Richard and Patricia Morelland and Charles, Admiral Hawthorne, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the ghost. Senator Rebecca Westbrook was there too. She'd become an unexpected ally, using her position to push through legislation that helped other veterans who'd fallen through the cracks. She and Maggie had developed a cautious friendship, 2 women bound by the complicated legacy of Thomas Westbrook. The president stepped forward with the Navy Cross. "Lieutenant Margaret Rivera," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force. Your unwavering courage, dedication to duty, and personal sacrifice exemplify the highest traditions of military service." As the medal was pinned to her dress, Maggie thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The capture, the torture, the lost career, the decades of struggle. The son who'd given her purpose. The recognition that had come too late and yet, somehow, exactly when she needed it. She thought about Thomas Westbrook, whose betrayal had cost so much but whose daughter was working to make amends. She thought about the other veterans who would benefit from the legislation Rebecca had championed. She thought about Marcus Chen's grandchildren who existed because she'd endured. The applause started, and Maggie looked out at the faces, some familiar, some new, all appreciative. For 40 years she'd been invisible. Now she was seen. After the ceremony, as people gathered for the reception, Admiral Hawthorne pulled her aside. "I never thought I'd see this day," he admitted. "After so many years I thought justice was impossible." "It's never impossible," Maggie said, watching Daniel laugh with Charles and some of the other young officers. "It's just sometimes slow." "You're at peace with it now?" Hawthorne asked. "All of it." Maggie considered the question. Was she at peace? She thought about her new job helping other veterans navigate the system. She thought about the house Marcus had given her, the medical care she was finally receiving for her old injuries. She thought about the friendships she'd formed with people like Patricia, who'd gone from condescending to becoming one of her closest supporters. "I'm getting there," she said finally. "Some wounds never fully heal, but they can stop hurting so much, and sometimes that's enough." Rebecca Westbrook approached, hesitant as always. "Ms. Rivera, congratulations, you deserve this." "Thank you, Senator. And thank you for everything you've done." "I should be thanking you," Rebecca said. "You could have destroyed my career when the truth came out about my father. Instead, you gave me the chance to be part of the solution." "We all deserve the chance to be better than our worst moments," Maggie said. "Or in your case, better than your father's worst moments." Rebecca smiled sadly. "I've been thinking about writing that biography of my father. The real story this time, not the sanitized version." "Would you be willing to contribute? To tell your side?" Maggie thought about it. "Maybe. If we can do it in a way that helps people understand how these situations happen, how the system can fail people, if it can prevent future betrayals, future cover-ups." "That's exactly what I want," Rebecca said. "The truth, complicated as it is, because that's the only way we learn." As the reception continued, Maggie found a quiet corner to sit for a moment. Her joints were aching, they always did at long events, but it was a manageable pain now thanks to the medical care she was finally receiving. Daniel found her there. "How are you holding up?" "I'm good, honey, just taking a breather." He sat beside her and they watched the party together in comfortable silence. Finally, Daniel said, "Thank you for not giving up, for surviving, for raising me, for fighting when you needed to, for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Maggie said. "Being your mother has been the greatest honor of my life." "Even more than the Navy Cross," Daniel teased. Maggie laughed. "Especially more than the Navy Cross, that's just a medal. You're my son. There's no comparison." As the afternoon sun streamed through the White House windows, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt in 40 years, genuine peace. Not the resigned acceptance she'd learned to live with, but real peace. The kind that comes from truth being told, wrongs being acknowledged, and justice, however delayed, finally arriving. She'd come to watch her son graduate. She'd found so much more. Recognition, yes. Financial security, finally. But more importantly, she'd found community, understanding, and proof that her suffering hadn't been meaningless. The ghost had finally come home. And she was home to stay.